And how can we define personal growth? I'm realizing as I'm thinking about this, how I define it for myself is any attempt of the individual, I'll just use myself, any attempt of me to make a change about who I am or how I show up to get a different result that I want instead of the one I don't want, to me is kind of the basic definition of personal growth. So somebody that isn't quote unquote into personal growth how you would maybe define it or I would define it, but they're like they learn a way to greet their partner at the door when they come in home from work every day, and they change that behavior. I consider that a step of personal growth. Now, it's not they're maybe not into personal growth, but just like I would say exercise is getting up off the couch and walking around your house or outside for a short walk, all the way up to lifting heavy weights every day in the gym. Both are getting exercise and pushing your body and stretching and moving your energy around. So when we say personal growth, is there a threshold to this? Is there an absolute to this? Like, what do we mean by that?
That's a great question. So I'm jotting down really quickly what I think is a couple different key indicators, because I didn't come in going, I'm going to have to define personal growth.
Of course. Well, I would ask you just define it for yourself. I mean, we don't have to give a formal definition. I think this is an exploratory topic in some ways. Yeah,
and I love that you asked it. So I think what I would just off the top of my head say is my personal definition of growth and development is when you consciously make choices to improve yourself or the systems around you to have a better result.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how big or little that is. But when you also have to think about it in a long term, you have to kind of see it as a long game, because when you start making these choices and changes, consciously making changes in your life to improve, or in yourself to improve yourself or the systems around you, a lot of times things get worse first. And it takes a while to actually see the return. So growth isn't a quick fix. It is a long-term systemic fix. Like, it's an attempt to make long-term systemic changes so that you will eventually improve your life.
So with that in mind, again, this goes back to the removal of the ethics or the morality from it, because I would argue that there have been many dictators around the world who changed themselves and the system around them to get a different emergent, that I would disagree with the reasons they did that. I would say that's an immoral or unethical thing to do. And yet they were in a framework of personal growth. They were growing themselves, their capacities, their abilities, and they were changing the system to the one they wanted. I don't agree with how they did it. I don't agree with what they wanted from it all. But with that definition, that working definition, it reinforces the fact that you can remove the ethics from it. There's nothing that makes you superior to be into personal growth. In fact, you may be a dictator or an assassin that wants to hurt people, and you want to continue to improve your capacity in those ways.
Right.
Right. So that's something to take into consideration. There's no absolute morality to this at all.
Yeah, I think most people who are into growth and development usually find their way to emotional intelligence of some kind, and so most of the time it turns into a flavor of something that isn't evil. I know
I'm really going down into this. I get it. I'm pushing back, but you get the point.
You're creating distinctions, and I think that's important. So I think the other thing is that, as far as I'm concerned, the end game on personal growth and development is that it accelerates maturity. So maybe that's an even better personal definition, is anything that accelerates maturity. And I don't have a definition for maturity, so I hope that's okay. But if you think about it in terms of, levels of development based on ages, as we age, there is an expectation for us to be at a certain level of maturity at a certain age. If we're acting like a 5-year-old when we're 5, that's fine. If we're acting like a 5-year-old when we're 10, that's not okay. Even though it's only a 5-year difference, it's definitely not okay. If we're acting like a 5-year-old when we're 15, something's probably wrong.
Yeah.
And so what personal growth does is it makes sure first, and I think that this is why people get bitten by a bug when they have challenges and hard times. And we can even maybe at some point in the future do a podcast on like levels of aging maturity and how that actually also impacts type.
Yeah.
Is like how we develop through our time. But Erik Erikson, who was a psychiatrist who, I think it was a psychiatrist, definitely at least a psychologist, who studied children's development, and in my opinion, a total genius, saw that each developmental level was effectively a complete and total ego change, and it was a response to a bunch of challenges that the child could not solve at their current level. And so they basically had to completely reform who and what they were at each of these developmental levels. And so oftentimes when those of us who get into growth and development do something similar when we're older, it's because we probably missed something in our maturity, in our maturation. We missed something. And it caused major problems later that forced us to do something similar, which is like completely reevaluate our ego and be willing to alter it and change it up for something that was mature enough to deal with the situation at hand.
Yeah.
And most people who are just a little bit into growth and development, they just need a little of that. But I think when people get super into growth and development, they start liking it. They start getting access to levels of maturity that are sort of beyond their years. And I think this can loop back into why it's imperative to understand type. But at a certain point, I mean, one of the challenges to being super into personal growth is that a lot of people complain that it's really lonely, right? And why is it lonely? Well, it's lonely in some ways because it's hard to hang out with people who aren't your peer group. You know, like it's nice to hang out with children, and it's nice to hang out with people who are older, and that's really great. But there's just something about hanging out with people around your own age, right? They're peers. They kind of get where you're at. You get too far into growth and development, it's harder to find peers, people who have gone down this road with you. And so one of the disadvantages is that it can be a lonely path. And that usually only happens to people who got bit by the bug. Because why would you do it? Why would you keep doing it if it doesn't have constant and perpetual rewards? So you get bit by this bug and you want all of those levels of maturity. If a person isn't, to route it back to the very beginning, when I said that if you're not into personal growth, you're going to hit a glass ceiling of understanding type, is everybody who is into growth and development at this level, who is maturing, maybe even beyond where the overwhelming majority of humans mature by the time they hit their 70s or 80s. If you just keep maturing, then if you're not a person who understands how that path works, you might not be able to see people who are at higher levels of maturation than what you're expecting to see. And so you might not know what you're seeing because type follows them there. Type helps us understand the tools of cognition that we're using. But our access to tools, it almost seems like the tools themselves become better when the user becomes better, right? Yeah. Like it's like a baton in the hands of somebody who's just learning how to twirl a baton is a completely different thing than somebody who has become one of those fire dancers.
Yeah.
Right. It almost looks like the tool improved. It took on a whole different life, but it's just the relationship between the skilled user and the tool. And so the reason why you'll hit almost like this glass ceiling of understanding type is that you might not recognize that this tool is the same tool as it was being used at lower levels of maturity in the hands of somebody who is now at this really high level of maturity, and it's like a whole different enchilada for them. Gotcha. And so if you want to understand the system at its, like if you want to understand all of the access to the system, you have to be somebody who understands how this personal growth process works and how the tools alter and change based on where we're at.